We are thrilled to welcome Charles Fisher, founder and CEO of Unlearn, to the show today. Thank you once again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So amazing to have you on, Charles, and amazing to have you on behind our founder spotlight and just have you back on to tell the full story around our Builders episode. So really to kick things off, Charles, could you just share a brief personal intro with us?
Sure. I'm Charles. I'm the founder and CEO at Unlearn. Um, I am a theoretical physicist by training. So I did a PhD at Harvard, and then I had every intention of staying in academia and being a professor. So I did not one, but two postdocs in physics, one in Boston University, and then one at a university in Paris. Before moving back to the US to work as a machine learning scientist at Pfizer back in Cambridge. Um, and all of my research in academia as well was on kind of at the intersection of physics and machine learning and biology. So taking mathematics from physics and methods from machine learning and trying to apply it to solve problems in biology. But I had a brief period of existential crisis where I thought, maybe, you know what, I don't want to do this biology stuff. They don't like mathematicians like me. I should leave. And I moved to San Francisco to work at a virtual reality company as a machine learning engineer. But I felt the pull back into working in the medical space. So started Unlearn now, I think approximately 6 years ago. And have been working on building it since.
It's been a long journey for sure. I'm so excited to dive in here. And I love your path to bio. I think we covered this in the Founder Spotlight originally, but again, some more circuitous than others, and your entrance into bio. I'm excited to dive into kind of what brought you there. But just before we jump in, could we just also just get a quick brief background on Unlearn itself? Just introduction on that side?
Sure. Officially Unlearn.AI is our legal name. From the beginning, it's is an AI artificial intelligence company. We focus on kind of two different technological aspects, which are the development of generative models for creating simulations of patient outcomes, and then methods for using those simulated outcomes to improve clinical trials. And so we partner with biotech and pharmaceutical companies who are running both phase 2 and 3 clinical trials to help them accelerate those trials by leveraging sort of the simulations of the participants in their study.
It's a fantastic introduction, Charles. I love it. And like any good physicist in the background, love to see the classic whiteboard
Everyone always
in the
comments
back.
on the blackboard in my background, and I'm always like, "You've never met a physicist before?" Like,
Oh no, come from
yeah,
a few physicists, man. It's always a fantastic start. It depends on the chalk you have too. I know a couple of the folks that are
I have the special Japanese full touch chalk. Yes, I
found
know.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. That's amazing. You perfect background there. I love it. We'll continue it on, Charles. We'll love to start around the origin story here. So you mentioned now at this point 6 years, right? And in 2017, you founded Unlearn, really with this mission to accelerate drug development by adding machine learning generated digital twin data to control arms of clinical trials. But just taking a step back, Charles, I know your path to bio was back and forth. There was a journey here. Just if you could take a step back for a moment, just tell us more about the genesis of Unlearn. What was the spark that really started it all?
Um, so the genesis of Unlearn, and you may look at our name, Unlearn.AI, was a couple of things about that. We never say the dot, so Unlearn AI. One is at the time we started the company in 2017, almost all of the research that was being done in AI, still is, was being focused on computer vision, how to recognize objects and images, create images now, and natural language processing. Those were the two areas of machine learning and AI research that were really dominant, still are. And we thought that kind of we wanted to say, well, there are lots of other important problems in the world that don't fall into either pictures or text, and we wanted people to kind of forget about the dogma that they had learned from those different areas, and come here, and we're going to have to try new things. The other part of it was that it is a portmanteau of unsupervised learning. And so when we started the company, 2017, we did not, okay, really have a focus on clinical trials. Clinical trials was one of the variety of areas that we were considering. What we had a focus on was generative artificial intelligence method. And myself and my co-founders, John and Aaron, all of us, three of us are theoretical physicists, mathematicians. And in physics, we spend a lot of time working on creating computer simulations of various complex systems. So you could think about computer simulations of proteins, for example, in the biology space. That's actually what I did my PhD on. And the way that these would work is you would start to say, well, there's all these different atoms, right? And one's a positive charge, one's a negative charge. We'll describe the physics of how, and you would build up the system piece by piece. So there's a bunch of problems with doing that. One is complex system got lots of pieces. So then those tend to be very, very computationally intensive algorithms. A second problem, though, is because they have lots of pieces, you need to explicitly describe how they all interact with each other. The models are very, very complex. And then the last part is that you're starting describing the small scale, and then you simulate the big scale, and you get a propagation of errors. So the problem is they just don't work. These simulations just don't work. So the basic idea that we had was rather than trying to figure out how we can describe each piece and build mechanistic models of things, could we use generative AI to learn to simulate different types of systems? Then that fundamentally was the place where we started. And then you say, okay, if that's what you're focused on, where are the areas where we might want simulations of really complex systems that are too complex to do mechanistically? It's a couple of areas that are interesting. Climate is interesting. Weather is interesting. That has turned out to be an area. People do work on that now. But one of the major areas is human biology, right? Human biology is incredibly complex, way too complex to build mechanistic models. And so we thought that was the target area that we wanted to go after. But the real focus for us at our core is Unlearn has always been an artificial intelligence company. That our goal is to advance the state of the art in artificial intelligence and use it to solve problems in medicine. But that first part that's a key part of our soul. If we ever lose the part of us that says we're not just using AI, we are inventing and advancing machine learning algorithms to push that field forward, the field of machine learning and artificial. If we're not doing that, I don't know what we're doing anymore.
No, it's super interesting too. The clear separation, I think, is fascinating, especially entering the biospace, right? Starting as a genesis of an AI company, moving in. So I really think that's fantastic, and I think there must have been a lot of learnings, a lot of centralization of saying, hey, we're going to go into clinical trials, we're going to focus in on bio because of the complex data sets. So before we just chat more about Unlearn's approach specifically, maybe could you provide a bit of context for our audience? Just share more about the current difficulties within the clinical trial space that you and your team members just said, hey, we have to go after this. We have to fix this. Maybe just some of the key unmet needs of the space.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a lot of areas of medicine where the huge amounts of variability and uncertainty in patients' outcomes have a really big impact. All the way down to patient individual care, right? The fact is that it's really, really difficult to know if you have a disease, what your outcome is going to be, what's your disease course going to look like. And the large amount of variability in outcomes when we get down to testing whether or not new treatments work, it means that you need a huge number of people to really figure out in your experiments if the actual treatments are really having an effect. Because some people will just get worse and some people will just get better. It has nothing to do with the treatments. It's just variability. So that variability swamps out a lot of the signal that you're looking for. And so as a result, clinical trials, particularly like phase 3 clinical trials, they may have thousands of participants. Recruiting those participants can take many years, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars in many cases to run these large clinical trials. And so a big part of our view first of all three of those things I just said are problematic. The problem that takes forever, costs a huge amount of money, that's problematic. But the other thing is that half of the patients in a clinical trial, they're receiving treatments that already exist and where we have huge amounts of data on how people already respond to those treatments. So, half of the people are assigned to a control group effectively. And so our thought is that by using these generative models trained on data, historical data of patients with that particular disease, that we are able to kind of help to resolve these three problems. So as patients enroll in trials, we can create what we call digital twins of those patients. Their digital twin is going to predict how they are going to respond if they were to be assigned to the control group. And that's going to enable us to work with pharma companies to run trials that can achieve really high power while having smaller control groups than normal trial design. And that makes them generally smaller, so you don't need to enroll as many patients, so they don't take as long. And you don't have to cover the cost of recruiting and identifying and monitoring those patients, so they are less expensive. So you have a trial that is both faster and less expensive for the sponsor, but also better for all of the volunteers who are participating in these trials because fewer of them are randomized to the placebo.
Yeah, I mean the idea that you mentioned is certainly intuitive, and some of our more loyal followers, listeners of BIOS will see that we have touched around this space, both from the biopharmaceutical lens in some of our roundtables, along with some of our other guests that have circled around the idea. But within clinical trials, I think digital twin is something that we have reserved, and I wanted to chat a bit more with you, Charles. I think as you and Unlearn have really seen this space grow and develop over the past 6 years, just getting a bit of ground setting information from your perspective as someone in industry, building these models, working with these data sets in clinical trials, partnering with these large pharmaceutical companies, I think would provide a really awesome lens. So, just to kind of start here, could you just briefly explain digital twin data, just potentially the benefits as opposed to current clinical trial methodologies carried out at large scale? From your perspective, maybe if we could just cover a few things rapid fire. When was the space created from your space? From your perspective, where are we right now in the space? What progress still needs to be made? Maybe just a bit on that context. Would love to hear more from you.
Sure. So let's talk maybe about what we are attempting to do with digital twins, right? Um, Taking a really big step back in terms of thinking about what you're actually doing when you run a clinical trial. Every clinical trial is fundamentally trying to get at a question of a comparison. You're comparing what happens to a patient if they receive a new treatment to what happens if they don't. And we call these things potential outcomes. So each patient, when they enroll in a study, what you would really like to be able to do is to measure exactly how effective the treatment is, not on average, not in the whole population, but for that person. And the way that you can do this is that you take the patient at the beginning of the study and you give them the experimental treatment and you follow them for some period of time and you observe how it affects them. And then you get in your time machine and you travel back in time to that point when you gave them the experimental treatment. And now you don't give it to them at that exact same point in time. And you observe what happens as they, progress not on the treatment. Now you have these two outcomes and you can look at the difference. And that tells you how effective the treatment was for that patient. Of course, there's a thing we call the fundamental problem of causal inference, which means that we don't have a time machine. We can't see both of those things. So what we are basically doing with a digital twin of a person is using a computer model, in this case, one that is trained via AI, to predict one of those potential outcomes, which is what would happen to the patient if they did not receive the experimental treatment. And that information is half of the information you want to get out of a clinical trial. So having a ton of that information from these models allows you to make much better clinical trials. And we'll get into this a little bit later because there's two technological problems. One being, how do you do the machine learning? How do you use AI to actually create such a thing, this digital twin? The other one is any machine learning AI model that we have, it's going to make mistakes. And so how then can you figure out how to incorporate that information into the clinical trial so that the trial is immune, totally immune to any mistakes the model makes? So you get the right answer from the trial, even if you have a model that might make some mistake. In terms of this space of clinical trials or digital twins, there's a couple of things that I would say. So one, digital twins are not just a tool for clinical trials. Clinical trials is the first area that we want to bring digital twins in health to. A digital twin is a computer model of an individual person. So you can have a digital twin of me, Charles Fisher digital twin, and you can put different types of information into that model and ask what would happen to Charles Fisher in all of these different scenarios. Suppose that, this could be just basic health and wellness scenarios. Charles Fisher is going to decrease his cholesterol. He's going to eat fewer eggs. How's that going to affect his risk of heart attack in the future? All the way to thinking about things for what that could mean for particular disease areas or things like this. The focus on clinical trials initially for us is really around two different aspects. One is there's a very clear need in the industry to make clinical trials better. Just earlier today, I was in preparing for a conference on frontotemporal dementia that I'm going to this fall. And one of the things that everyone on the panel was discussing is it's a very small patient population. And you have a number of pharmaceutical companies trying to come out with new drugs. And how are they going to enroll people? If you've got 10 pharma companies all going after a 1,000 person patient population, that's going to be really difficult to actually run all those different clinical trials. So it stops being a question of how do you make drugs. And now the bottleneck is actually finding patients for your trials. And so these types of things can have a really, really big impact on different areas in clinical trials. The other thing that I think is sometimes surprising to people is we think clinical trials is the easiest problem. So one of the reasons why we went after this area is we view this as the easiest problem because when you're actually running a trial, there's still some randomization. So there's still randomization of patients, the treatment group and the control group. And that randomization allows us to ensure you get the right answer out of the trial, even if the machine learning model may make some mistakes. Whereas when you move into other areas, like we're thinking about personalized medicine and things like this in the future, but your models need to be much better. You can't have them making very many mistakes. So as our models get better and better, we unlock new kinds of applications in the future. Your last question was the history of digital twins or whatever in this space. I know I'm rambling here for like 5 minutes, but just you said, when were digital twins in healthcare? When in medicine did they become a thing? I would say June 2017, the day we created Unlearn.AI. That's pretty much the day that they became a thing.
No, boy, seriously. And I think as your models have trained up and grown, I think that was what I was fascinated to see from your perspective was some of the history, some of the trends, how you all are entering the space, just changing it up. So, I mean, let's start with 2017. I'd love to dive into your approach, Charles, maybe get things going here.
Okay.
Just a little bit, if we can share some sides here. I mean, Unlearn's addressing a lot of the challenges that you're mentioning in clinical trials through your developed digital twin generators. Sorry, just D2Gs. But it's just set to accelerate the process of mapping longitudinal patient data, extrapolate this work, be able to solve these problems. And just as a side note, I think it's been fantastic to even look at this in the history of the future. I'd be curious from your side, even just as orphan drugs and new sides are coming out in the future, as precision medicine gets even better, the problem does become amplified for certain. I bet you and the team think about that a lot. But continuing this on, I mean, why don't we just start here? I mean, could you tell us a little bit more about Unlearn's solution, how it addresses some of these challenges? I mean, really arriving at this Unlearn solution 2017, what was the core components that you wanted to develop to make this work?
Initially, the very, very core component that we were thinking about, and again, kind of getting back to that, our core soul is that we're an AI company, was how would one create a digital twin of a person? Given that a person is so incredibly complicated, the human body has 37 trillion cells in it, which is 100 times the number of stars there are in the galaxy. So how would you do that? Right. So that became kind of the first question, is how would we even try to address that problem? So at the very beginning, we were focused on just machine learning research on how you would be able to even do that. And that continues to this day. Over the past year, about actually an entire year, we pretty much completely redid all of our machine learning technology. So we are today in June or July, I guess, of 2023, using a totally different machine learning technology than we were in July of 2022. That did take about a year. And when I say totally different, not just different for us, different for the world. We had to invent a completely new type of neural network to be able to solve this problem. And we're not done. we have a whole research group that is continuing to think about how we would do this in the future.
Oh yeah.
Um, in the early days, though, our initial thought was kind of the simple way of thinking about this is that, okay, you have a patient who's receiving an experimental treatment. We're going to use the model to create a simulation of what would happen if they got the control. Just the difference between those things is the treatment effect. Average that across your patient population, 100% of whom are receiving the experimental treatment, and you've got a clinical trial that gives you the treatment effect but has no control. That's actually really, really, it's like a very seductive idea. Could you run reliable clinical trials that don't have control groups at all? And we were not the only people thinking about that at the time. There are other methods that are actually extremely different from what we do called synthetic control groups that people focus on. So a synthetic control group, you're going to take a database of patient data, of real patients that you have that have previously existed or that maybe currently exist. And you're going to take a subset of those people. So I'm going to say, I'm going to take Steve, I'm going to take Stacy, but I'm not going to take Adam. And I'm going to take Steve and Stacy, and I'm going to call their control group for my trial, but they're not actually randomized in. I'm just selecting people from some other place. And that's one way. Whereas what we are doing is very, very different. We're saying we're enrolling people into a trial. Steve enrolls in the trial. We take the data from Steve. We put it into this pre-trained AI model. We create a computer simulation of Steve. And we say, what would happen to Steve if he were to receive a placebo, for example? And we do that for every patient who's in the trial. And that's kind of where we started. We were focused on what we would call trials with external control groups, where that control group is a simulated digital twins of all of the patients. But what we kind of discovered or realized, we didn't discover it. What we realized is that when you go through that thing and you estimate, you say, I got the difference between what really happened for the patient and what was predicted to happen. I measure that difference. What does that tell me? Well, that's actually two things stuck together. It is the effect of the treatment that's there, but so is if the model was good. Those are stuck together. If your model is wrong, then the treatment you would estimate doing that, the treatment effect would also be wrong.
Right.
And no one wants to get that. You don't want the treatment effect to be wrong. So this would have been probably a couple of years after we started, because the first couple of years were really all about how could you create digital twins of people. And then we started to think, well, okay, we need to come up with trial design that can use the digital twins, but do it in a way where you make sure you still get the right answer from your trial, even if your model makes some mistakes. And the fundamental tool that we use for doing that is randomized treatment assignment. This is the tool. And the basic idea is that when we run a trial with randomized treatment assignment, a patient enrolls and we create their digital twin, but we're blinded to whether or not they're going to be assigned to the treatment group or the control group. We don't know. It's double-blind study. And so some of the patients are going to receive a placebo, and we are going to predict what will happen if they got a placebo. And so now you have a group of patients in the study where you can actually measure and what I would call recalibrate your model. So you make sure that your model is not introducing any bias into the estimate for the treatment because of randomization. So that was really the second 2 years, I would have said, was like first 2 years, how do you build a digital twin? Second 2 years, how do you use a digital twin in a randomized controlled trial? And then the last 2 years, spend a lot of time on regulatory in making sure that the things that we had developed are going to be suitable for use, not only in phase 2 trials, but actually we want to be able to address the primary analysis in big phase 3 clinical trials. I think that's where huge amount of the time and spend is, and it's the most important problem. So we want to make sure we're developing methods that can be applied there.
Yeah, and we'll certainly get there. I'm really curious to see how you're seeing this space overall evolving into later stages of clinical trials, being able to move into the space itself. I want to stick on that first 2 years for a second, and I was really glad you brought this up, Charles, on the side of validation in the perspective of if your machine is broken in the first place, the whole thing could be a wash, right? I look at the same thing. We've had similar debates with this on BIOS on the side of even when we're talking about building proper data sets. And so you look at the side of, hey, garbage in, garbage out, whether it's the model, whether it's the data, with your own partnerships and your own development in those first 2 years. how are you really thinking about developing, sourcing, partnering with folks to develop out those proper data sets? And what was that journey like for you and the team to actually build something out that was a reputable model that you could trust and use?
Well, I think that there are three different things. So there's the data you use, there's the models and the way you evaluate it, but then there's, which is maybe even more important, is the way you use the outputs of a model. The thing that I think people tend to really struggle with, and I always come back to it, is because of the way we use the outputs of our models, you actually don't need to believe our model. Okay. So if our model totally didn't work at all, the worst thing that happens to you is you end up running just a regular one-to-one randomized controlled trial. It produces the same things that it would have produced if you didn't work with us. Right. So it's like we kind of can't really mess your trial up. That's one of the most important things. I call this zero trust AI. You should be able to work and use AI to solve a problem, even if you have zero trust in how the AI is actually really working. Of course, that doesn't mean we're trying to build AI that doesn't work. We're working really hard to build it so it does work. And that gets into these other two pieces. I think that in terms of the underlying machine learning methods that we use, we produce a huge amount of evaluations. I'll call it evaluations of how the models work. We're not building simple models. These are sophisticated deep learning based generative models also. Generative models are really hard to evaluate, because if you go use ChatGPT, for example, you type in a prompt and it will produce some answer for you. Refresh your browser and type the prompt in again. It will produce a different answer for you. I always find this really weird. People will be like, ChatGPT gave me the wrong answer, but all you did was roll the dice once and you got the wrong answer. The actual question is, if you rolled that dice 10 million times, on average, what fraction of time does it give you the right answer? Because the probabilistic system. And so the same thing is true with what we do. We are generating probabilistic predictions for the future of a patient. So there's a huge amount of stuff that we can evaluate. On our website now, we've put out what we call spec sheets. So for each one of our released models, you can download a spec sheet, which produces, they're like 40 pages of evaluations of how the models perform on all different things. So we're trying to make sure that we're being really transparent about what their performance really is. Then you go to the data side. On the data side, internally, we focus on data quality over data quantity. Now, within healthcare, there is this weird anti-correlation. The larger the data set is, the worse the data in it are. And I don't know just kind of how it is. So the way that we end up creating data sets, at least, is that we're aggregating data from lots and lots of different sources. So our data sets go through kind of a pipeline where, first of all, we're going out there and partnering with people, or even purchasing data, and we're bringing it in. Once we have brought those data in, there is a huge amount of quality control that is going on to be able to take that raw data set and turn it into a data set that we feel like we can really learn from. We call these things internally, we call them data montages. We haven't talked too much about them, but it's not just the data. It's the data combined with a huge amount of information about that particular disease. So we'll have all of the context that you would want to have as a data scientist about like what all of these things are. What are all these variables and why are they measured and what do they mean and all of that kind of stuff. Right now we've amassed a data set of the quality controlled data. Our quality controlled data is a little less than 100,000 patients. So we've got about 100,000 patients, a little below that, across neurological diseases primarily. That's actually in this quality controlled format. We have a huge amount of data that's still in the raw format that hasn't made it through that pipeline yet. So I mean, we focus on kind of these three things, which is building those really high quality controlled data sets, then really evaluating our machine learning models really rigorously. And the last thing is making sure we've developed clinical trial designs that require zero trust, where you can be sure the clinical trial will produce an unbiased estimate for the treatment effect, even if you didn't like all that stuff that we did beforehand. So we want to make sure checks and balances, right? You got checks and balances in all three of these phases.
100%. No, it's a pretty clear cut through of how to actually aggregate and pull this together. I think it's fascinating what you all have done to do this. And as we're talking about data aggregation collection, I mean, Unlearn's approach to getting this in, because you're in a new field, because you're working with such large players, obviously there are a lot of barriers to this. One being trust. I think you mentioned that up front right away, saying like we want to build a zero trust system. So I'm just curious, Charles, from your perspective, like if we're kind of honing in on these first 2 years, but I bet even now you still have to do this. I mean, your platform works closely with many of those innovators in pharma and biotech to accelerate clinical drug development. I mean, could you just tell us more about what drove Unlearn's partnership approach and just what convinced early adopters to really sign on and just come trust with you guys and come work with y'all?
I think the need. I mean, the truth is that people have clinical trial. Kind of everyone in pharma agrees that the current system is not sustainable. You
Of
have
course.
Eroom's law, right? The reverse of Moore's law. Drug development is getting harder and more expensive over time. Everyone agrees that this is a big problem. Not that many people seem to be willing to do much about it. I think that there's kind of some incentive issues as to who's really incentivized to make sure that their trials are not an Eroom's law contributor. But there are some people that really strongly believe that they should be pulling out all of the stops to get these drugs to patients as quickly as they can. And so we search out those people. We're looking for people who are going after diseases where they have difficulty in enrollment. And there's a lot of diseases like that, by the way, not just small ones. There are also large diseases where maybe you require 3,000 patients for your clinical trial, which is just very hard to enroll. So we search out those people and we focus on building relationships with the actual people who are running these trials in these companies. Our goals are going to be, we think that we are incredibly early. This is people forget that all of these techniques that we're talking about in AI and machine learning are invented in the last, what is 2023, 10, 15 years, right? All of these things are stuff from the last 10 to 15 years, which by the way, I always laugh. I talk to people and they're like, we've been doing AI for 40 years. And I'm like, that means you're not doing AI. It's this, right? If you say
Right.
that means you're
Right.
not
Right.
doing AI. Right. So all these things are new. Like all of the technologies, a lot of the technologies are just the last 5 years, 3 years, right? So these things are all really, really new technologies. And I don't remember where I was going with that, but that's
No, I think it ties back to what I was saying, Charles, right? Is
oh,
this
trust. You're asking about the trust
history?
in the innovators and stuff. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh,
So,
dude.
we think that we're early, I guess is what I was saying. So my view is what we can do now, we think is great. We think that we can provide an amazing amount of value now. And we
Yep.
think but we're going to blow people's minds with what we can do in 5 years and 10 years from now. And so what we want to do is build relationships with these companies today, and provide a lot of value in their trials today. But our goal is to be able to completely blow their minds with what's possible in 5 to 10 years. So it shouldn't be just like right now, we basically partner with people one trial at a time. You're running a phase 2 or phase 3 trial. Maybe we'll do those together. We'll work with you on that. But fundamentally, I think every single clinical trial should be run this way. And our goal is to figure out kind of how to make that possible.
Hmm. I I'm excited to talk a little about partnerships, and I think how that evolves is pretty interesting how you laid it out. I'm excited to get into the future here. But I mean, just as we're talking about the burgeoning side of this field, how much that's changed in the past 10, 15 years alone. Um, Again, I think Unlearn from the start, you all have just taken into account the mass challenge of scaling one of the largest bottlenecks in the current drug development stack and just narrowing this focus a little bit further. I think I'd be really curious from your perspective what really the unique challenges are that you see within digital twin AI companies that really face in drug discovery and development today. I think there's a lot of unique challenges, especially as the field's evolving, but I'd be curious to see from your perspective what you're really seeing.
Sure. So first of all, I would love to get a list of those other companies because I'm not familiar with any other companies that really work in our space. I do think which actually does highlight one of the challenges, I would say, which is, so there's a handful of challenges that I might say. One is language. One thing that we have definitely encountered is people don't really know the difference between a synthetic control what we're doing with the digital twin. They don't know the difference between different kinds of AI technologies. People are using digital twin to mean all kinds of stuff. I've heard people use it while we use it, which is literally an AI-driven computer simulation of an individual person. And I've heard people basically refer to digital twin as a person's electronic medical record. Well, those are completely different things, right? So there is kind of what I would say is when you're bringing new technologies into a space like this, there's a language barrier, and that language barrier creates confusion. And I would say that is definitely a problem that everyone kind of has. I think one of the things that I think about this a lot, is that Unlearn is a tech company. The majority of the people who we hire are tech people. We hire engineers, we hire computer science, we hire physicists. We also have statisticians and a few clinical scientists, but we're 75% engineer, machine learning, physics, math, right? That's kind of who we are. And so that means that kind of we are different in a lot of ways than our customers. We're different. We come in with a different perspective and a different background. I think that's good. If we looked exactly like our customer, then it wouldn't be clear what value we would be adding. We want to be adding some sort of complementary, different thing. And we're not making drugs, right? We are focused entirely on one problem, which is how can we use AI, advance AI, invent AI to solve this particular problem of creating digital twins of people and applying them to make clinical trials better. That's the only thing that we do. So that I think there's this language challenge in this kind of culture clash sometimes that I think is an issue. I actually don't think I think that's wrong. Not a culture clash. I shouldn't have said that. It's a language challenge. It's just the aspect of people, I think, sometimes speaking different languages. On the technical side, the challenge is data quality. That is the challenge. The data quality in healthcare, broadly, is much lower than what you have in basically every other application of machine learning. And so figuring out there's kind of two aspects of that. So one is, well, we have to do a lot of manual work to make the data better. There's a huge amount of manual quality control that goes into creating the data set. But the other side of that is, again, everything that we do in machine learning is weird. If you look at Unlearn's machine learning stack, we put a blog out about this on Monday. I described one of our architectures. No one else in the world does anything like what we do. Everything that we do is built from scratch. All of it is patented technologies that we invented. Everything we do is weird and new. And why? Well, because we encounter different challenges because we're working on these messy healthcare data sets that are much messier than other areas of machine learning would encounter. So you can't take the same techniques. You have to develop new techniques that are able to work with this kind of data. And I think, again, that's our soul. That's what we're here to do. We're here to say, if you think of what would be the ideal data set? The ideal data set for us, we would take 1 million people. We would enroll maybe more, 10 million people, right? We would enroll them into a study, an observational study, for example. They would go to the doctor every single day. Okay. And every day they would be given the same exact battery of exams, but you need to do this in a way that doesn't disrupt their life because you still need to have their it's just
Right.
not a thing. And
Yeah.
so there is no such thing as an ideal data set. So whereas compare that to the image generation companies, right? How many pictures can you download from the internet? As many as you want. Are they noisy? No, you can download as many high resolution images from the internet that you want, right? And so I think that a big part of the challenge here is not only making the best data sets we can, but recognizing that even the best data set we can make is going to be not what a lot of machine learning people are used to. And so we're going to have to invent new machine learning technologies to deal with those problems.
Yeah, and that's completely why I asked Charles and why I'm so curious because the field is so new, right? And it's like, I don't even know the other companies that are doing what we do, right? I think seeing that sentiment, I've seen that with other founders before in the past, especially in emerging fields. It's interesting to see on your level. I mean, what has changed and how much you all have had to evolve with the industry. And I look at builders episodes like these and just moments like these as this is an opportunity to just discuss with future founders and other folks. as a side question, something just to ask out of curiosity, do you have advice for future founders trying to build an AI, trying to emerge into bio, trying to get into this space? Things you just wish you knew 6 years ago, right? Where you're like, gosh, if we had this, right?
Um, I mean, I think I have a lot of advice for people. I think my first piece of advice, this is not the advice most people want to hear. My first piece of advice to potential founders is that they need to really think hard whether or not they want to do this, right? Whether they want to be a founder. I think that yeah, I talk to a lot of people who really want to be entrepreneurs. They just want to be an entrepreneur. And I'm like, well, why? And I think it's because they think it's going to be cool. And I always tell people it's kind of not that cool. It's actually a really hard life. And it's a huge amount of work. I work 7 days a week, every day, all the time, holiday, doesn't matter. I'm working, right? It's a hard life. So you need to be really, really motivated by a problem. There needs to be some problem that you are willing to sacrifice everything to solve. You have to solve that problem. You will never give up. Honestly, that's my number one piece of advice. Don't start a company until you find a problem like that. When you find that problem, then start your company. If you already started a company, the advice may be a little bit different, but for potential founders, future founders, it's like, don't start a company because you think it's going to be cool. Start a company because you found something in the world you have to change. You have to, and you can't rest until you've done it.
Sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And within AI specifically, as the field's emerging, any thoughts, questions, advice, guidance that you just give to folks that are saying, hey, I'm going into AI?
As researchers or as founders?
We can probably, I'll probably skip it in general. I was curious, with just from your field as an emerging person in digital twins. I think you're certainly not going to be the last company.
We
I'm
will be.
more curious. Yeah, no, right. Like they're going to pop up. Um, I I'm just curious on the side where it's just like so much. You've seen the field even change so much in 6 years.
Mhm.
Kind of like, if you were going to start this company now rather than 6 years ago, if there was advice, if there was stuff where you're just like, I wish I knew how to articulate this language better. I wish I could partner with this easier. AI companies should be working in this field, or they should start in this clinical data. If there's nothing there, there's nothing there. I was just out of pure plain curiosity, but
I mean, I don't think it's that simple.
yeah,
I think that the most actual advice, particularly for technical founders like myself, that you have to learn about is the people stuff. Like it's the people stuff that you're going to be doing that, and it's the people at your company that make it do anything, right? It's not your idea, it's not your data, it's not your algorithm, it's all the people that you hire and that you work with. I think everything that I would say that's really important that I have learned over these 6 years has not about the industry. I worked in the industry before, right? So it's not really about the industry, not about the technology. I'm an AI researcher. It's not about that. It's
yeah,
all about how to find people, organize people, get them aligned, get them all working together. Those are the things that are most important for founders, probably, and the
100%.
hardest to learn. Unfortunately, I do think it's the kind of thing you can only learn by getting the scar tissue yourself.
Oh no, I 100% agree. 100%. So continuing on here, Charles, I would love to just jump in, just to a section just talking about just some of the major challenges, accomplishments, just the sections we've talked about with Unlearn. I mean, you've found incredible success since your creation, really pioneering this new tool, accelerating drug development, raising almost 85 million to date. Just looking back, what have been some of the greatest challenges you've just faced building Unlearn?
Um, I think that there have really been two main challenges, I would say. One technical and one social. Um, it's extracting what I would describe as general startup challenges of how do you hire people, all that stuff that I just talked. So the kind of unlearned specific challenges. One has been the technical side. This is a difficult problem. It is much more difficult, I think, than most people think until you actually see the data and you try to do it yourself. And you're like, oh no, oh, this was way more difficult than I thought it was going to be. And to be honest, that happened a little bit with us too. So yeah, I think I mentioned earlier that the machine learning methods we use today in July of 2023 are totally different than what we used in July of 2022. So a year ago, everything was different. And one of the big reasons why we made a major switch in our machine learning technologies, some of it is about the performance that we're getting in terms of our models. Our new models are better than our old ones were, but that's only actually a small part of the story. The bigger part of the story is how much easier they are for us to use. Internally, it has sped up our speed on our machine learning team by like 10 times faster. So the things we were using, they were hard to use, they were finicky, they were slow, all things that were hard. We could get them to work, but it was hard to get it. It took a huge amount of work. And now it's like we push the button and it works kind of out the box. And we're like, oh, that's so much better. And now instead of trying to be like, how do I get it to train at all? It trains great the first time. And now you're being like, well, how do I get it to train even better? Right. It's a much better space to be. So I do think that the machine learning challenges here, that has been hard. But again, that's literally why we started the company, is because we knew it would be hard. And working on a problem that's unsolved means you have to invent something new. And that's why we started the company. The other thing has been just the general risk aversion in the industry. I would say that's the other challenge that we and probably every other digital health company encounters. Scientists are inherently skeptical of kind of anything new. And then the use of technology and math and computers in biology in particular is unfamiliar for most people who are in the space. And so trying to get new technologies here adopted is hard. And I think that for us, we've done a huge amount of work on our own, plus with partners, interacting with the regulators. We were able to go and receive a qualification for our approach from the European Medicines Agency last year, for example. Doing all of those things is really, really important. But the thing that's been interesting is like the regulators are much easier to convince that our technology is works and is acceptable than is the actual industry. I would say. So the industry, in my experience, the people who work at the pharma companies are more conservative, more risk averse than the regulators, which I think is really, really quite interesting. So that's the challenge. It is really a pretty risk averse, slow moving industry. And I think that it's probably the number one challenge facing the industry. I think it's the origin of Eroom's law. And so I think the question is going to be, well, again, how do you kind of bridge that gap between being a tech company and trying to move really, really fast, and trying to be really, really innovative, but then figuring out how to partner with some of these companies. And some of that means that, there's big pharma companies and they can be all big companies, regardless of their industry, tend to move a little bit more slowly as by nature of their size. And this sometimes, that means that we're going out and talking to smaller biotech companies who are more nimble, right? And so I do think that getting that go to market right, if you're building a new technology, finding the nimble people, and that actually, I mean that really directly, the nimble people, because we work with some amazing partners at some really big pharma companies where it's the individual people. It's even though they're within a really, really big company, they are super innovative and they're willing to be a champion and push this forward. The challenge is identifying those people. That's what I would say. That's the challenge.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that certainly could be a episode on its own. Some amazing content on that side. It's just working in partnerships on that side is definitely a big growth. Um, I just want to flip the coin here real quick. Talk about the past 6 years on your own. Charles, from your own perspective, what have been some of the greatest accomplishments, milestones that you've reached as a team, things that you just want to share or just excited about looking back?
I mean, there've been a huge number of things. I think that as a founder, maybe just as me, I don't know. It's actually really difficult. This is a difficult exercise. As soon as I climb a mountain, I'm like, what's the next mountain? Like, it's very difficult to think about looking backwards. I think that, we look at some things like our regulatory milestones, like the EMA qualification from last September, even just, I remember very much, we had a meeting with the FDA in March 2020, and just getting that meeting and going to FDA. I think it was a very interesting time too. Beginning of March 2020, meeting at the FDA was an interesting time. So, we've got the regulatory milestones, a lot of machine learning. We've invented a huge amount of new machine learning technologies. Interestingly, by the way, the things we've invented aren't pure medicine focused. You'll see papers that we put out that have computer vision papers and things like this that have nothing to do with medicine. Those are underlying machine learning technologies. And I'm quite proud of a lot of the work we've done in inventing these new machine learning technologies. Same thing with new kinds of clinical trial designs. We've done a bunch of work and that kind of dovetails with our regulatory work. And then, we've got, again, this is actually relatively recent, but the work that we've been able to do in our data set, and actually really getting, I think, some very, very, probably some of the highest quality data sets in the industry. These are all internal to us. So we're not sharing the data or selling the data or anything like that. But the data sets that we've built are really, really great. And I mentioned our machine learning team is like 10 times faster. That's partly because of this new machine learning architecture. And it's partly because of how much better we've been able to make the data in the last year.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. I think, look, well, I would love to just look at the next mountains ahead for you and yourself, Charles. Just looking forward here, just projecting out to the future. What's coming
Um,
next for you and Unlearn?
in the short term, we are focused on, well, we have some current partnerships that we think are really exciting. So making sure that we can make these current partnerships really great. We're also planning to release new digital twin generators, new AI models for new indications pretty much monthly. So we'll be, as I said, we're moving a lot faster now than we were. And so we have an update to our Alzheimer's model that I think we're planning to release very soon, maybe even tomorrow when we're recording this, I think actually. And then we have some new disease areas that we'll be releasing next month, and then we'll have sort of a new one after that. So that's all kind of new. Right now, this is the long-term thing that we're working on. Right now, we build specialized models. So we would build a model for Alzheimer's disease, a model for ALS, a model for Parkinson's, for example. And it's one model per disease. But most of the things that we've seen in machine learning over the last couple of years are not like that, actually. The new machine learning is build general model. And so this is our big long-term initiative. We want to build one model of all disease, one foundation model for human health that allows us to create a digital twin for every person on Earth in principle. And that is an ongoing research area. I think it's really, really important to understand why we want to do that. So one aspect, this is a whole bunch of underground machine learning things as to why we think it will work better. So it turns out that specialized models tend to do worse than generalized models, even at specialized tasks. It's an interesting point, but that is something that tends to be true. But one of the bigger things that we really want to be able to do is to work in some disease areas where the patient populations are small, right? And so there are a huge number of rare diseases where there's a huge unmet need for this, but we can't get data from 5,000 patients to be able to build a specialized model. But if we have a generalized model, then it might be possible to still do a lot of work in these rare diseases, even if you only have data from 5 patients. And people in machine learning call this few shot learning. And so this is a big area that we are focused on right now in terms of our R&D, is to build a generalized model to unlock the capability of moving into some rare diseases. And that's something that we're focused on a lot, probably over the next year and a half.
A few shot model seems really interesting, especially as you're engaging with regulatory systems, discussing that standard. I think that's a really, really fascinating approach and a workaround to kind of the current stack we have right now. But that was a direction I wanted to take this real quick as we're just looking out to the future. As you and Unlearn scales up and your technology, just the broader space grows, hopefully we'll see again, like I discussed earlier, orphan drugs, more, applications within precision medicine, other spaces there. I'm curious to see kind of your thoughts around as your platform and as your system grows, these access to tools in generative AI and digital twin at some point, rapidly becoming kind of industry standard across the board. As someone looking at atop a mountain with a couple ahead of you, where do you kind of see this tipping point happening as far as the industry? If
Mhm.
you could either point out, sometimes people say, oh, 10 years, it's a time frame. Other folks, it's kind of just saying, hey, I want these couple things to change, and that's a big tipping point for the industry. Where do you kind of see that from your perspective?
Um, I think that there's going to be a couple of points. I actually think that they're pretty precise inflection points. Well, one's precise, one's a little fuzzier, but the more precise one is really still around some of the risk aversion in the industry. For these trials that we work, which you call twin RCTs, they use digital twins of people in the RCTs. The work that we've done on the regulatory side with the EMA, I think it's very important. It lays the foundation for these things being suitable. But we still have we would like to be able to make an announcement about some really concrete steps with the FDA. And I think that having us come out there and make a public announcement with partner, for example, about some concrete steps forward with the FDA will do a huge amount for the industry to see that, okay, this is not, this is real, right? This is something that you
Right.
can do and you can run in your clinical trials and the regulators are going to accept it. And I think that's going to happen soon. So I think that, knowing who we are working with, I hope that is something that can happen soon. And once you have that, I think that the barrier to to scaling this out is actually coverage of the models across lots and lots of diseases. At some point, we have a huge amount of inbound from pharma companies. We frequently have people reach out to us about, hey, could you help me in such and such disease? And we say, is it Alzheimer's disease or ALS? And they say, no. And then we go, well, then we can't help you today. Maybe we could, like, if it's Parkinson's or if it's something like that, maybe it might only be 1 or 2 months. By the time we sign the contract, it will be done, right? But if you're talking about, oh no, it's an oncology indication or it's some, pulmonary indication, that might be a lot longer. And so I think the key step there is that we need to scale out these offerings across every single disease. That is the thing. Once there are the ability to create digital twins of a patient in any disease, I think that this becomes something that is an industry standard.
Hmm. No, I
And one thing that would accelerate that is having one model for all disease, one general model that would accelerate that.
right. And I think generalized models when you're talking about digital twins, if you're seeing that as the future, it's a really, really interesting entrance. As far as the blanket term to get this to happen is really fascinating. I think to close things off here, I just have a couple rapid fire questions just to really cap off our conversation here. Again,
Mhm.
Charles, it's been amazing to have you. Um, as we're talking about tipping points, I really want to take this out like a little bit farther in the future, right? And so I think a common question we just typically like to ask at the end of this is imagine it's kind of 2050, right? Could you really describe the drug development space from your own perspective? What challenges have we addressed? What diseases have we treated? Where are we going now?
A really interesting question. 2050 is a long time, and we are in an interesting time right now. I saw some tweet just today where someone was like, somebody turned the future back on. Like the future was off and they flipped the switches back on. There's so many interesting discoveries or potential discoveries. Some of them we'll have to see how they play out. But 2050, I think the thing for me, the question is, I think that the technologies that we will have in 2050 will amount to enabling a kind of science fiction type future that people kind of can't even really imagine. Very difficult to even imagine what it would do. Um, do I think like that's what 27 years from now, right?
Mm.
Um, do I think that there's a decent possibility we achieve AGI in the next 27 years? I do. I do think that there's a pretty decent possibility we achieve AGI in the next 27. Um, if we achieve AGI in the next 27 years, then I have no idea what drug discovery and development looks like. I mean, it's very, very difficult to think about what the future where we have computers that are generally smarter than people at everything. What does that future look like? I have no idea. I think that for us, our goal is sort of to build that general model of human health. So I think that the technology in 27 years if we've done our job, is such that you have this general ability, this general digital twin, that you can create a digital twin of any person that walks into your office. You can create a digital twin of that person. You can forecast what their health will look like in the future. I think that if we've done our job, that exists in 27 years. The question that I have is not around the technologies, but around their adoption. There are lots of cases, particularly in some industries like healthcare, where new technologies are adopted much more slowly than they should be. I mean, and so the question is, even if those technologies exist, is their adoption equally distributed? And that, I think, is a difficult question for me to answer. I don't know.
100%. And I think honing in a conversation as well as we're predicting where AI could be, where those future technologies could be. Um, are there milestones? Are there ideas that you see within digital twins? I mean, potentially you could describe the same just for the digital twin space in general and in 2050.
It's medicine.
Right.
I mean, the way that I look at this, to be totally clear, is that I think if you really have the ability to create what we view as the future, the end state of a digital twin of a person, a computer model of that person that allows you to simulate their future health under whatever scenario you're interested in, that's medicine, right? That's what medicine is. So it is I think that I really like to think about this in the long term, and I don't know how long it takes. I mean, 2050, what's your over under on it being available there? I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you imagine that sort of AI driven future of medicine, where like we've solved AI, what does medicine look like? That's the kind of future that I want to think about. And I think that that future is basically creating a universal digital twin generator that can create a digital twin of any person. And it can then basically, the way I always use an analogy, when an engineer builds a bridge, okay, we don't just build it in the real world and then by trial and error see how many bridges fall down and which ones don't fall down. You first build them in a computer. You build the bridge in a computer. You simulate what happens if there's an earthquake. What if the wind hits it like that? What if it hits it like this? And then after you've solved all the problems in the computer, then you do it in the real world. And I think medicine should be the same way, that we should do all of that stuff in a computer and you only treat the patient after you know the right thing to do. And that's what we are trying to build. It's incredibly difficult to build. And it's going to take a long time, but 2050 is a long time away.
100%. I mean, we're excited to follow y'all along and continue on with the journey, just unlearning yourself, Charles. Um, as we close up the episode, I just end here. Any closing thoughts or just shameless plugs you just like to share with the audience?
Oh, it's a very, very broad question. Everyone always asks these questions. Um, I mean, the main thing that I would say actually is for people who want to learn more about what we are doing at Unlearn and what we stand for, the best place to look at this is our company blog on Substack. So we put out, for example, we have something I called our Top Secret Plan for AI in Medicine, Part 1. Okay, that is available on the blog, and you can read about where I think AI is going to, digital twins is going to unlock things over decades. It's meant to be a fairly long-term plan. And I am currently working on Unlearn's Top Secret Plan for AI in Medicine Part 2, and I plan to release that as a new post about that sometime in the next month or two, depending on how much time I get to devote to writing. So that would be the shameless plug, is for people to check out our blog to learn more about what we're thinking about.
That's super, super exciting. And I hope to dive into the thought leadership. I hope our audience gets to as well and just follow that on the next month here. I'm excited for part 2. And just, Charles, thanks again for a wonderful episode. Grateful for your time and excited to hear the full story on Unlearn. Thanks again so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.